Okay. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Brett is the biggest threat to your winery. And no, we are not talking about the yeast today during the webinar. I am Michelle, and I'm the growth manager here at Innovent. For those who are hearing about Innovent for the first time, we are a winery management software designed by winemakers for winemakers to simplify and streamlining the winemaking process from bud break to bottle. Now, I would like to introduce our key presenter. So we have Chris Miller here. He is currently the customer success manager at Innovent, but before that spent 15 years as a 911 dispatcher. He has an extensive experience implementing training methods that specifically cater to adult learners using problem-based learning and critical thinking skill development. In the wine space, Chris brings training, those same training skills to provide a comprehensive understanding to the Innovent clients and help them navigate through the software. And he's been an awesome part of the success of the client success team. So we're very excited to have Chris here to share valuable insights with us. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Chris to get into the content.
Well, I'm excited to talk about these things today as it's kind of merging two of my favorite areas, which is teaching and wine. So it's exciting to get to do that. Joining me today is one of my coworkers at Innovent, Sarah Rogers. She has been with Innovent for 2 years, and that's after 11 harvest careers in wine production, starting as an harvest intern, including time in Australia and New Zealand. Also joining us today is Bill Snyder. He's a Portland-based winemaker, wineries operations consultant, wine educator, all the things wine. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is investing in your staff, seeing in what ways you can take adult learning and problem-based learning exercises to your staff to run an efficient, safe winery, how that onboarding and training, like I said, let's train Brett, building a culture, and what types of things this might cost you in the long run. First off, investing in your staff. And we like our little play on words about Brett being not only that debatably horrible yeast in your space, but also that new hire, that generic new person that's come into the winery, be it an intern, a long-time, full-time employee that hasn't worked in your program before. And we need to train that person. And we need to train them to be safe and educated for their sake, your winery's sake, your brand's sake. And typically what we find, or what I have found, is the "we've always done it this way" mantra puts people in unsafe situations. The "well, I had to figure it out on my own," they can figure it out as well. You know, we're putting people into these commercially unsafe spaces with chemicals and all sorts of tools. If they don't know how to use it and they don't know how to ask the question, which sometimes is the hardest part, is the admitting that you don't know, then we run the risk of injury or financial loss or anything else, even though they're there to help.
Chris, something I've encountered, I've explicitly run into people saying just that, of "we've always done it this way." But I think something that's even more widespread is almost like a culture of "we've always done it this way," without even people sometimes knowing that they're engaging in that culture. I think in a lot of ways, both because of how much a lot of wineries look to tradition, but also because there's no one right way to make great wine. I think there is a lot of assumed knowledge that goes in a lot of different directions that sometimes you really have to actively work on fighting.
And exactly the case. And anytime that I've myself shown up in a winery, there's been this wide array of we're either going to kind of drill down on all these safety ideas, or One time somebody tossed me the keys to a forklift and said, "Hey, can you move this?" without even asking if I knew how to drive a forklift. And spoiler alert, I didn't know how to drive a forklift. So if I was one of those people that was motivated by not wanting to look like I didn't know what I was doing, or wanted to make a good impression on the new boss or the new winemaker that I'm working for, that has a high potential for injury or error. Or, I mean, you're driving around a mechanized vehicle with metal spikes on the front of it. So even simply just being aware of the surroundings and the educational level and knowledge base that these people walking into the winery may have is wildly important. And like you said, if it's just this constant downflow of, well, I had to figure it out, so you need to figure it out, it just begets this very dangerous cycle, because nobody wants to run a forklift through a wall.
Or drop those barrels on the ground because you're driving the barrel forward down a hill or something silly like that. Like there's so many small things that you can do that are not maybe a full-on forklift certification for everyone who enters your facility, but you can do a lot of basic helpful orientation trainings just, for new people, new employees, temporary employees, that can go a really long way to easing potential issues.
But then we always hear, I don't have time to train my people. I don't have time for that. I've got to do X, Y, or Z things. And like you said, Sarah, even if we can do small trainings, not, high level specialized trainings, it can have positive outcomes on it. We need to do better about training our people based on how they learn. And adult learners are not the same as how children learn or even teenagers learn. And we classify adult learners basically anybody over the age of 20. At that point, they've developed enough life experiences that typically their learning style shifts from this academia style to kind of the adult environment around them. The big 6 keys are that it's less flexible thinking. You've had life experiences, you've had things that are going to impact your thinking because you have formed your own opinions and knowledge base on things. So there's a little bit less flexibility in your thinking. There's typically more self-direction, which is great in the winery. You want somebody that's going to be independent, motivated, self-directed until they decide they're not going to ask for help on something and they're going to mess it up. They're very practical and outcome focused. Adult learners want to know the why behind something. They use a lot more personal experience, which of course leads to less flexible thinking, but that personal experience can be extremely beneficial because you're getting a different perspective, you're getting a different viewpoint on it that you can actually learn together through teaching something so that you have the most positive outcome possible. The hope is that they've got a readiness to learn, especially if you're hiring somebody new and they show up and they're there to learn and be a sponge and get as much knowledge as they can out of everything. So afford them that opportunity, teach them the things, but also understand that there is typically slower learning, but are more knowledgeable. And that comes from those personal experiences, life experiences, all those things that build up to having more overall knowledge about things, especially if they've come from, a wine education program. Bill, you were teaching up at the college, and I would like to think probably there was some safety talk in there.
No, absolutely. And the more knowledgeable usually I found works in favor of, I think, a lot of folks, both in terms of who decide to pursue some sort of degree in winemaking or just enter the winery. There's a real great diversity of experience, and I remember having literal PhDs in genetics in my classes, and it was certainly a resource, but it was a challenge to me too, in terms of knowing, first of all, made sure I wasn't just trying to blow any smoke and make sure that I was rock solid, but also too, making sure that if there are certain areas that someone that something would be remedial for someone, how do I best address that? And, you know, I think that comes into play a lot in the winery too, of even with seasoned winery folk, it's, you know, if they've seen similar pieces of equipment, but not the piece of equipment you're training them on, that can in some ways be a real value a lot of times. Now the whole idea of bad habits creeping in being brought in, that's a whole other discussion. I know some wineries who actively like hiring super fresh interns because they don't have any bad habits to unlearn. I know other wineries where they aren't going to be anybody's first internship ever. And I think me personally, I kind of probably split the middle of, you know, there's some of the best interns I've ever had. It's been their first internship, but there are certainly times when having an expert in a relatively lower level position like an internship can really be a real blessing too.
Yeah, especially, I mean, it was hard. I'm 2 years out of the wine industry now, but getting interns in for harvest, a lot of times you have to hire people with no experience because those are the people that are applying for your jobs and that stick around and are still showing up in August. But like I've got like that comment about, you know, like kind of that remedial basis is lots of times with those new people with no experience. If you start at the basics when maybe they don't fully understand like what fermentation is or like what it's going to look like or what the implications are of, you know, pouring an ad into the top of a tank that's fermenting, but like explaining the whys behind and making sure that they understand there's a reason why you're asking someone to perform a task in a specific way, that it's not just because we're checking a box, that there is a reason behind it. You know, you're not scrubbing tanks because we think scrubbing tanks is fun, but like you're getting in there and using the elbow grease because you've got to get that bacterial load off, and that's the way you're going to do it. So yeah, I've always found it really helpful to kind of start from the basics for a lot of our interns, and then you can always like skip that part if someone's like, yeah, I know that, or I'm from Davis. Like,
I'm from Davis. You know, one of the kind of fun things about being at Innovent and seeing how people write their work orders, I've just seen this huge spread of the information that people include in a work order for their teams. And some of them are very robust with the why behind we're doing this and every piece of information you could possibly need. And then I've got others that I've seen that's just the task itself. And you can tell that those are being assigned to people of varying understanding on what needs to be done. But even something as simple as making sure that if you've got an intern, learning through the redundancy of putting that much information into something like a work order for the day, so they understand, well, you're doing this because of this, that can be such an educational tool for that group of people that are out doing that task. And obviously, wineries at varying levels of sizes are going to have a different approach to all of that kind of stuff. But having that written down just really reinforces the importance of it and gives somebody kind of a roadmap. But then, you know, we talk about these characteristics of learning styles, but then it turns into feeling like you're just screaming into a void, so to speak. And that's because we might not necessarily have addressed the root of how people learn. And those are the characteristics of learning for adults. And ultimately, we need to address different learning styles. I would like to think in most cases, especially because of the work that winemakers do, we see very similarly kind of, it's almost like a genre of people. The personalities tend to be kind of similar. The things that, you know, kind of make them light up is similar. And that would tend towards then their learning styles are probably fairly similar. I would like to say, and I've noticed in teaching winemakers how to utilize Innovent, that a lot of them heavily are kinesthetic learners that want the hands-on activity, want to be working on things, want to be doing these things. But understanding how somebody can learn can make training so much less frustrating for both a trainee and a trainer. I'm somebody that is a very auditory learner. I know this about myself. I can be talked at and go and do a task. Probably something to do with spending 15 years doing 911 dispatch and being talked at constantly. But ultimately, that's a really easy way for me to learn things. I don't tend to be a visual learner. I don't need graphs and charts. And the irony, of course, being that I've put a graph and a chart up here for everybody to see. But it's so overlooked sometimes that not everybody learns the same, because we didn't grow up in an environment where we were taught differently. You know, in school, you're taught one way because you've got anywhere from, depending on where you grew up, 10 kids in your class to 50 kids in your class. And that's, the teacher just presented you information.
And I'll say too, I think inevitably when we start talking about training, we start talking about bandwidth. And that's something when I was teaching at a college, I had the luxury of, essentially unlimited bandwidth for all the instructional part. And that's not a luxury that every winery has. And I can imagine some folks thinking, hey, I don't have time to, it's like, I know I need to teach people how to defit a tank by our protocols. I don't know if I have time to come up with a graphic and, rattle off what to do and, walk them through it. And I think this might be a theme of this entire presentation of this is, it's investment. It's a little bit of work up front that will pay off dividends throughout the life of throughout the term of the employee, not just in terms of needing to re-educate, remind later, but also in terms of preventing oopses, whether that results in injuries or loss of product or loss of equipment. And so, and this doesn't have to be a term paper or anything like that, but it's a nice exercise just to start doing of okay, maybe you're someone who really works by, written procedures or really work. I know until you can tell me a million times, but until I actually do it, I'm going to do it really, really slowly. And just kind of start thinking about what that would look for you of hey, what are some of the things what are the most important things, either things that on a particular task, either things that get forgotten the most or the most kind of dangerous. And how would you frame that for a kinesthetic learner in terms of hey, stand here when the tank is doing this? How would you frame that for an auditory learner of hey, as you're walking off with the work order in your hand, here's the 3 things I'm gonna, yell after you. And again, so yeah, it doesn't have to mean a fleet of 3 different SOPs or something catered to every single person's learning style, but definitely keep it in mind, both in terms of how you're framing your approach to training as a whole, but as well as a leader, how you're carrying yourself. Because that, at the end of the day, they're going to look to you, and the culture and the tone that you're portraying just with your body is really going to, or in many cases, will trump anything that you put in someone's hands in terms of a learning material.
And hopefully, if you can address early on how somebody learns, that should shortcut everything else. That should make the investment in time less, because they're going to be absorbing that information in the way that's best for them, so that you don't maybe have to tell somebody 6 times how to do something because you addressed how they learn. And most people know how they learn by the time they're in their 20s, particularly if there's somebody that's in their 30s or, older. So ask them, get that out of the way. Hey, we want to make sure that you're learning the information that we have to teach you in the best way possible. So how do you learn best? Are you kind of a hands-on person? Which really in the wine space, I think it does draw in people who are more kinesthetic style learners as a whole. They want to be hands-on. They want to be, in everything. And so if you're just yelling instructions at somebody from across the room or across the winery, they might not be absorbing that information in the best way as if you were walking them through it and doing at least the task with them a couple times. So, understanding how someone learns, again, can make it so much less frustrating for everybody involved. And it's just kind of a question that doesn't get asked very often. In 911, what we implemented was a little survey essentially for somebody to determine their learning style. Go down, answer the questions based on how they were phrased, and it would say, you know, you kind of lean towards being a kinesthetic learner, you lean towards being an auditory learner. Ultimately, even though those learning styles are separated out, it's more of a Venn diagram where people tend to lean more towards one, but it crosses over in a lot of ways. So knowing what their dominant learning style is can really go a long way. And then, of course, there's always going to be roadblocks to training and learning. These are all scientifically proven that noise, heat, movement, discomfort, lack of sleep, all these things have a very negative impact on someone's ability to learn information and retain that information. And of course, if you're hiring somebody at harvest, it's probably during the hottest part of the year. The winery is noisy. There's things constantly moving around. If they're too hot, they're probably not comfortable, or they're sitting on a stool. And if they're working long hours because you've got an early AM pick and then you're in the winery all day, they're probably running on very little sleep. So at least in the beginning, finding ways to have maybe an onboarding day or a training day where you can sit somewhere or be somewhere where maybe it's a little bit cooler and less noisy to focus on safety or game plans for the day or what the rest of the season is going to look like, so that you can really take an opportunity to lay a foundation of safety and education, knowing that in other moments these factors are all going to be fighting against you essentially. If you've got somebody that's even on a bottling line, if they're stacking cases on a pallet and they're overheated and they've been out there doing that for 8 hours, and you tell them, hey, in an hour I need you to go do X, Y, and Z inside, they're less likely to have retained that information because of the just physiology of what's going on with their body when you tell them that. Write it down, put it on a piece of paper, give it to them so that they can read it later. The idea of reducing any potential for error is going to be safer for everybody. So finding ways to eliminate the roadblocks are significant, so that all of that information and effort and the things we're talking about, we're putting in that intent and effort up front, albeit an investment in time, is actually paying off because you're not putting yourself in a situation where you've got the elements fighting against you, basically. Because again, all of these things are problematic in a winery. It's loud. There's things going on. There's people moving around. Even in small wineries, it might just be too hot that day.
Do your safety
People's
training in the cellar, in the barrel room.
Yep. Because physiologically, you can learn and retain information better if you are slightly too cold than if you are too hot. Heat always comes down to heat. Seems to be the problem with everything. Anything that gets too hot, we start running into problems. So people are the same way. Gets too hot, you're going to have a harder time memorizing, learning, and retaining information. Little too cold, apparently that's fine. But heat is one of the bigger keys there. So who has time for this? Who has time for trainee Brett? Who has time for any of this training, this idea that just figuring it out might not be the best way of existing? But ultimately, who has time for the mistakes that Brett, the trainee, might make, or the new hire? Who has time for OSHA fines? Not everybody has the luxury of a safety coordinator at their winery that comes around and makes sure that there's lockout, tag out, that makes sure their SOPs are written, to make sure people are following their SOPs. If you're a small winery, you don't have somebody that's holding you accountable. You have to be holding yourself accountable. And that's going to take time also. But even beyond fines, damaged wines, damaged equipment, there is a high potential for someone filing a lawsuit because they got injured on the job, who wants to pay out that workers' comp claim. So even just knowing
I'll
that,
interject too.
yeah, go ahead, Bill.
I think people have, you can read the news and you can Google incidents at wineries, but you would be surprised the number of wineries that have dealt with some sort of like insurance settlement or financial, consequence through some sort of regulatory body when something goes wrong. The big stuff makes the news, but there's a lot of little stuff that you probably know people in the industry who have had to deal with some of this stuff and aren't talking about it. And so I think there's a tendency for people to think about the total like worst case scenarios, which happen often enough, but it doesn't have to be a barrel dropping on someone for some pretty serious consequence to happen here.
And that goes back to, my last point here, which is that everyone kind of remembers that winery where an accident or incident occurred. And that's not always good publicity. You remember these things, you hear these stories. I know a coworker was telling me about a rumor that they'd heard about an incident that occurred at a winery. And, after taking 911 calls for as long as I did, none of that sounds like a rumor to me. It probably happened. And they aren't scare tactics. They're not things out there like boogeyman style stories, because ultimately nobody wants anybody to get hurt. And whatever can be done to avoid those circumstances is important and worthwhile. That investment in training, again, addressing it from a standpoint that is coordinated and intellectual and benefits everybody. There's no negatives to that. There just aren't. If it's a day, if it's 2 days, if it's a half day, whatever is going to help your program be safe for everybody and make the best wine possible, make the best product possible, there's no negatives to that. Sarah's going to go over a couple things that we kind of discussed off camera that are kind of minimums that you can do for these training programs, or just simple safety, which is kind of the key here. So Sarah, I'm going to turn this over to you to go over for us with your background.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think everything that you guys have said about, considering this an investment, it's an investment in people's future safety, your winery's bottom line, your time later on in harvest, once somebody's properly trained and you trust them to do something that you might have taken several hours at the start of harvest, but now you don't have to think about it anymore because you've got someone that can do that. So we put together these few points that, if you are stretched, you don't have your safety coordinator, but things that you should certainly look at addressing. We're not qualified compliance or safety experts. OSHA is a real thing, but these are some bullet points that we thought that everyone can do before maybe going to the official OSHA website and looking at more resources there that are more specific. But first of all, from a safety standpoint, your SDS sheets, you should have them. You should have them for all your cellar chemicals, all your gases. You should know how to read them, and you should tell new hires how to read them, and especially your interns. They're pretty easy to get. You go to the supplier website, you can download most of them, print them out, pop them in a binder. You, I think, can just get them sent standardly with your material orders. If you ask your supplier or distributor, they should just, whack them in with a packing slip so that you can keep them someplace safe.
And I'll say too, this is something that's pretty much, you talk to anybody who's gone through an OSHA audit, this is a given. They will absolutely pick someone who either looks like the newest member on the team, or I've heard this more than often, if someone looks like maybe English is not their first language, the OSHA auditor will probably ask them and say, where are the SDSs? And so this is something to keep in mind too, if you are employing even a facilities person of, this is something that will be asked. And this is something that's a real low hanging fruit.
Yeah, and then based on those SDSs, the PPE, so your personal protective equipment that you need to have, all the SDS sheets tell you everything that you should have, your chemical resistant gloves for lifting, eye protection, ear protection, respirators for your SO2 gases.
Respirators for SO2. I don't just pull my shirt over my mouth.
No, you go like
bandanas,
this.
the bandana.
Safety
pull the
squint.
bandana around.
But make sure you have it and that it's available for all your people. They know where it is and when they should be using it. And say maybe you're not going to put on your chemical resistant apron and your gloves and your face shield every time, but come up with your minimum standards and communicate that to everyone so everyone's on the same page. What is your bottom line for safety at your winery, and make sure that everyone follows that. For those of us in the West Coast and other locations, keep your N95s around in case you have a high particulate matter day from the nearby wildfire. Those are always good to have too. So making sure that new people you bring on site and you should know where all that safety equipment is. And that's not just PPE and where it's stored, but that's going to be, your first aid kit, where are the fire extinguishers, where are your eye wash stations? And if you don't have them, what are your alternatives? Is there an AED on site? All that's really important. And when you're telling people this, write it down. A coworker of mine mentioned that all of this should be documented and signed off for your meetings so that you can show OSHA if they show up that, yeah, we did train people on this. John signed right here that he was here on this day when we, pointed out the fire extinguishers and we trained on SDSs.
And even on the
thing is easy, not easy, but important.
Even to the AED point, a lot of people might not even know what an AED is, how to use it. It's not that everybody on site needs to be CPR first aid certified, although that would be cool. If you're in a position to where you can offer those types of trainings, because wineries located in remote locations down a 7 or 8 mile gravel road, how fast do you think an ambulance can get to you if you need an ambulance? And again, that's my background on things is it's not like they're waiting at the end of your driveway for something to happen. There's a delay between calling for emergency services, getting that information to a dispatcher, and especially if you're out in a rural community, you've probably got volunteers that are responding. So they have to leave their homes and residences and jobs to go to a station, get the apparatus and drive it out to you. Everything that you can do in those worst case scenarios, an AED, having somebody that's CPR first aid certified, are incredibly important to know what to do. And if you don't know what an AED is, it's worth understanding. There's lots of great first aid videos online that can at least explain topically what all these types of things are. So again, that's worst case scenario guy coming in. And knowing how long, having worked in rural communities, it can take for an ambulance to get to a site of a very major event.
Exactly. So safety first, as we always like to say somewhat facetiously, even though, at the heart of it, it is true for us in this industry. We work with a lot of heavy equipment and dangerous chemicals on such a regular basis that sometimes we stop thinking about it. And on that note, my third point was to understand yourself and train your people on the importance of lockout, tagout, and things like confined space. So lockout, tagout, don't go inside a live press that's still turned on, for the love of God. So have either a lockout, tagout protocol, or at a very minimum, disconnect your machinery from all power sources, including air, before cleaning and maintenance. It's just so important. And interns and new people might not really understand the power of what they're working with.
Especially if it's time consuming, like your press example of, it's like, oh, of course I want to just like hop in, spray it out, rotate it a few times, and hop in again. It's like, well, yeah, that's entering and exiting, lockout, tag out, as opposed to just off and on.
Yeah. And it does take more time, you know, and sometimes you're like, oh, but I just need to do this. And it's kind of building that bottom line from the beginning, you know, that these are the expectations that your team has, is that it is worth, you know, the extra minute to go back to the wall and turn it off and turn off the air and turn off the switch if you're not going to lock it out, but just taking that extra time and, you know, letting your team know from the top that it's okay to do that because that's the right thing to do. And that's the expectation. And
Avoid,
so help
avoid
says, and if you don't do it,
complacency.
you might get fired after the first or second time.
Avoiding complacency.
No, that's a good point. And I think that's maybe the topic for another webinar, but like the follow-up on these issues of, you know, it's one thing to train people, but it's another people to hold people to these standards too.
Yeah. And all you can do, I think, is start with the training and start trying to build that culture up before you start any kind of enforcement, as it were. And linked to lockout, tag out, I put confined space, but basically CO2 awareness. You know, there's all those horror stories, you know, about someone fell into a tank or got knocked out leaning over, went out on pump over, out to the worst case scenarios, you know, of people dying. So train new people about, you know, the dangers of CO2, have confined space trainings, especially for digging out tanks, make sure there's ventilation, and look out for each other. And just, I know it's hard for small wineries, maybe only one person going in on the weekend, but try not to work alone. You know, there's risks. And then again, document any of these kinds of safety trainings, any of your protocols, because it is important to have that written word somewhere. Just a sign-in sheet and throw it in a binder somewhere. More fun, your cellar protocols. Maybe you don't have, you know, a dozen written SOPs, but it's important to communicate what your expectations and SOPs are, like from cleaning tanks, setting up all your pumps and presses, but to make sure that everyone is starting with the same expectations. And for new people, either monitor the execution, walk it through it with them, and at a very minimum, go back and check the results to make sure that they're doing things properly. Stick your head inside that tank they clean to make sure you're not going to pull a handful of must from underneath the door, which was always my favorite, or opening the valve and finding it absolutely blocked with berries. But just make sure that you're watching people and training them as much as you can, because that is the investment for the end of harvest and for the rest of their winemaking career, if you are starting them off on the right foot. If you don't have any written protocols, something did to me once, which is you can suggest that they write up the protocol, you know, at the end of harvest, the beginning of harvest, like, this is what I'm telling you to do, and you prefer to read from your visual learner. Can you write this down for me? Like here's a notepad. And then they have a protocol and you have it for next year.
And that's a great feedback loop, because that's getting that outside perspective that, you know, they came in with some fresh eyes and asking them what worked for them, and an end of season survey almost. I've talked to a couple winemakers that do that, you know, what worked for you?
I'm a big proponent of a post-harvest review. You can really, you know, we get used to the limitations that are imposed on us, equipment-wise, facility-wise, and sometimes all this stuff aside, it can be a nice breath of fresh air of like, hey, you know, it turns out if we did have equipment X, like this will save a lot of us some quality of life and possibly improve the wine too.
For sure. Last point on this slide, so I can finish up. I mean, at a minimum, outside of any SOPs, be open and available, and, you know, build that culture that questions are okay. Like, no matter how somebody learns, if they don't fully understand what you're telling them and they're afraid to come ask for help, then either they're not going to do something at all, they're going to ghost you for a while and nothing's going to get done, or they might just take their best stab at it, which might be okay if it's something where it's that safe kind of situation, or it might be, make an addition to the wrong tank because they didn't really understand what you asked them to do. It could be any number of things if they don't think they have a resource to go to for their questions.
Well,
Sarah,
thank you,
I have
Sarah.
a quick.
Go for it, Bill.
I have a quick
Jumped in
question
at
for
the same
Sarah.
time.
Thanks for highlighting some of these, super crucial issues that can literally kill people. Taking a step back, what have you found to be some of the most either sensitive or important or overlooked pieces of instruction, whether we're talking about safety or protocols or just winery culture? Is it something that, in your experience, people often miss the most, whether it's what the end should look like or what the beginning should look like, or is it transitions, or what have been some of the, right? Can you think of one sticking point that everyone always makes this mistake kind of situation?
Gosh, that's a tough one. But I mean, doing your double checks at the beginning, I say would be the most important thing. You measure twice and cut once, and it doesn't matter if you're weighing your chemicals and you're like, oh, I'm going to go grab 2.1 pounds of tartaric, and then you get to the scale and all of a sudden you're like, was it 4.2? Was it 2.4? Was it what? And don't think that go back and check, and then weigh it again. Or you set something up, and if let your interns know if you're not sure it's right. We used to have people go set stuff up and then come back and I'll check it, and then you can open your valves and you can start. And that's when you point out, yeah, the tank's still sealed up there, or your suction's on the wrong end of the pump, or whatever it is. But I think that pre-start checks and awareness, and that's where you build confidence as well. When someone's like, can you check this? Like, yeah, you got it, you nailed it. Knock yourself out. All systems go. You're doing a great job. But check before you start. Check before you dump into the press. Check before you turn on the pump. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
All right, well, I think we're going to turn it over to Bill for a minute to talk about the punch down. So Bill,
Yeah, so
take it away. What's the punch down for all of us?
So the Punch Down is an online winemaker community that's open to everyone who's in a commercial winery. It's been something we've been working on at Innovent, and it's really been an interesting clearinghouse of ideas, a place to ask questions, a place to share resources, a place to kind of shoot the breeze too. But we've really been encouraged and galvanized by the types of questions that people ask. There's been some interesting discussions on kind of nitty gritty. Hey, have you used this type of stoneware, concrete tank, that kind of thing? But it's a lot of the questions have been kind of some of this more interstitial, or kind of the science behind the science kind of idea of how are you running your business, both in terms of business and sales support stuff, but also how are you kind of setting up your winery? What kind of questions are important? How are you setting up your cellar? There's a few things I'm going to certainly toot our horns about when it comes to the punch down. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So yeah, it's free. You don't have to be an Innovent client to be a part of it. All you have to do is sign up, being part of a commercial winery. You don't have to be a winemaker. I would say most of the conversations are enology based, but there's plenty of conversation on, as I said, growing your business, viticulture, other things like that. And I think there's been kind of the best response from community members when folks who aren't necessarily winemakers were injecting some of their knowledge. The nice thing too, and I was working at the college when COVID hit and having to go remote instruction at a time, I was scrambling for online resources, and there's a lot of really abysmal information out there on the internet about about making wine. And I think a lot of that comes from homebrew winemaking. And one of the things that's really important for us at the Punchdown is this is for commercial wineries and vineyards. People are speaking from experience. There are certainly interns who are on the platform too, and novices, but it's all kind of pretty straightforward, and it's pretty, you can tell that this is serious people talking serious questions about winemaking. As I mentioned, the topics are all over the place in terms of like just how I did a few things of like the nitty gritty of like, hey, are you using liquid solution or gas or whatever for storing your empty barrels, from that to, hey, I went to this seminar, or here are some of my big takeaways for those of you who weren't here in Oregon for this particular seminar. A lot of people share standard operating procedures, best practices, and kind of people who are experts in other realms, whether it's, let's say, data analysis or online marketing, have been able to share some really good like handles or handholds, for the lack of a better term, of like, okay, you're not a marketing expert, but like if you're going to start thinking about it, let's start with this. And then one of my favorite things too is that we've got people participating on the Punchdown from all over the world. It's certainly a lot of the West Coast of the United States, but plenty of folks Midwest and Texas winemakers, to say nothing of our upstate New York colleagues too. There are folks from other countries as well. And so it's been nice to see the cross-pollinations of ideas there.
Great. Sounds good. And I think now we're going to open it up to questions that anybody may have.
So with our time for questions, I encourage everyone to go ahead and ask questions, but I'll start with a question I'm curious about. So as I mentioned, when I was teaching winemaking during COVID, I had to really kind of scramble for a lot of online resources. And I know for a lot of things when it comes to especially safety, there's a lot of like, so the winemaking stuff online, definitely like vet it first, but there's a lot of really good safety resources, especially on YouTube, whether they're coming from state or federal OSHA agencies, manufacturers of equipment, or even universities and other learning institutions that have put their stuff online. But I have a question for you, Chris, are there any resources that you recommend in terms of, if I am a little more curious about different folks' learning styles and how to identify them, effectively address them? Is there anything you can think of like a good place to start there?
So yes and no to a point, because a lot of these adult learning documents that you find online tend towards academia, which you can adapt it from that. You can learn a lot from it, but it's really going to be up to the person that's teaching that information. And I think it's also important for the trainer to recognize in themselves that, they may have to kind of look at this broad spectrum of information, but the audio visual kinesthetic learning is abbreviated AVK learning styles. And looking up AVK learning, you get a ton of resources based on how to address these different learning styles. And if you can glean information from that on how to approach training somebody who might have a different learning style than you, because that's usually the biggest challenge is, I learn one way, this person learns another way, how am I going to teach them that? But having an understanding of how they learn, you can adapt the information more clearly so that it's more successful and, again, less frustrating for both of you on that two-way communication. But to Sarah's point earlier, when we were talking about, asking the question at the end of the season of, what worked, what didn't work, those feedback loops, and I know, Bill, you're a big advocate of that as well. Not having an ego when you ask that information about what works and what comes in, and learning from these other people is going to benefit everybody wholly. No one's going to come in and kind of attack you for the information that you're giving them, but building that trust and that two-way communication so that going forward, you know how to better educate the new hires or trainees, I think is really, really important. So a lot of it just comes down to communication. And I'm always happy to, if somebody out there wants to send me an email, I'm happy to even just talk about this kind of stuff back and forth and lend a hand, or at least give some advice on, things that worked for me in training people in kind of a chaotic space. Wineries are a chaotic space. A 911 dispatch center may come as a shock to you, is a bit of a chaotic space. And so you're trying to teach somebody how to do this thing in the midst of a chaotic space. So I've got a lot of experience with that kind of stuff. If anyone has questions that they just want to bounce ideas off. But AVK learning styles, there's enough resources out there to last a lifetime.
Cool, thanks.
And it's also good to go back and review these types of things. What worked, what didn't work. And that's part of that feedback loop, I think, is, if you kind of get stuck in a rut, just like that Ralph Wiggum slide, we've always done it this way. Well, that doesn't mean that there's not a better way or a more informed way of doing something.
Do you have any tips for dealing with resistant learners? I think when people encounter that in the wine industry, it's a lot of like, I think a lot of winemakers have had the intern where it's like, well, at this place, we do it this way. And, there's friendly and less friendly ways to really kind of nip that in the bud, but I wasn't sure if there's kind of a go-to phrasing or kind of, if you, in your experience, Sarah, too, of like how you've been able to box that in and control it of, other than just saying like, I don't care, or like, well, you're not there anymore, are you? I'm like trying to be constructive here and positive, or like, and then that doesn't, that's, that might shut the person up in the moment, but like, is there a way to kind of get someone on the path of reframing, being able to contextualize their previous, I think I encountered this a lot in people where it was like their second internship of like, it's like, oh yeah, what I learned in the first place was how it works everywhere, and now you're not doing something the way I learned it.
And I think that crosses, I mean, that happens in any industry. That happens no matter where you are. I think that even if you were bagging groceries at a grocery store and went to work at a new grocery store and they did it differently, someone would say, well, I used to bag groceries this way. You're always going to have those people to a point that might try to push back a little bit. But and not to dumb this down too much, but I think of it like talking to a toddler almost. Sarah, I know you've got, a young one, but the most effective communication with children tends to be when you get down to their level. And I don't mean like get down to their level and, throw a tantrum, but making eye contact and communicating effectively back and forth without towering over somebody. But if you're coming from kind of an intimidating space, then that doesn't create effective back and forth. So really trying to get to that point of understanding that, look, we're here to work as a team together. And if you're pushing against what we're doing now, just because of this previous experience, like we want to use that previous experience to learn from each other. But ultimately, this is the way that we need to move forward with our program and how we do it. And how can we get you on board with what we're doing? So not always coming at it from kind of the defensive or aggressive space, I think has been more effective when I've been teaching in other spaces of how to get somebody kind of on board with our way, so to speak.
This is why we do it this way here. And this is why we find it makes the most sense. And if it's something that really doesn't matter, if someone wants to clean something a different way, it's like, okay, like, is this really like an issue that we need to have a power struggle over? No, like it's getting clean. Like if you're not messing anything up, it's getting clean. You're not, it's the same amount of time, like do it your way. And someone wanted to do something different in the lab one time. He's like, this is how we always did it. I'm like, okay, well, do it both ways. And if you show me that the results are the same both ways, then you can do it that way. Like this is not my hill to die on. I mean, there might be a few of those out there, but I think explaining why you do things in a certain way here as opposed to there, and then just like doing things the way we always did them is not, it doesn't have to be like this. Sometimes you can learn things from your interns and new employees as well.
I guess
and to that point, empowering people to, in the lab example, do it both ways. Show me the results are the same. and we can see which way is going to be more effective for us. Like empowering people, giving them some ownership is very rarely going to create a negative.
I'll also say, I don't know if there's data behind this, but your slide talking about conditions that negatively affect learning and retention, I'll say probably also negatively affect patience of the teacher and ability to effectively train. And, it's nice to have some self-awareness to be like, okay, if you're at hour 13 of a harvest day and the truck drove into the ditch and the press just broke down and an intern just did something wrong, kind of it's, can't always be there, but it's nice to strive to be like, all right, let's remember that we're tired, we're hungry, we're hot before, considering how we're going to approach a situation with a subordinate.
Yeah, remember I learned somewhere once, and it's everyone's making the best possible decision that they can at that moment in time for them. Like no one is going into the winery and saying, I'm really gonna stuff this up today. Like no one really works like that. I mean, maybe they're out there. I don't know. But everyone's trying to do the best job that they can. And sometimes you might think it's really crappy, but you have to
But
consider
it's their best.
what has their training been like. Is there a reason for them to do this better? Maybe they don't know any better. Maybe they're tired, maybe something's wrong, but everyone's always trying to do the best that they can on a given day. And when it's in the middle of harvest, it can be hard to do, but it's kind of a good thing to keep in mind.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think I'll wrap things up here. This was a great conversation. Thank you all for being a part of this. Super, super valuable. And you'll see us around if you join the Punch Down. Bill has some really awesome webinar series and conversations that he does as well. He brings on some really, really cool and talented experts in the industry to chat things through. That series is called Crushing It. Are you done with that for this season, Bill, or do you still have a few more?
Right now, they're less frequent as we're kind of heading into the summer. We've kind of been chewing on it's been a nice kind of breadth of topics from viticulture, different AVAs, dives into clones, dives into growing your business, both through data analysis and online advertising, talking about different wine aging formats. We're kind of all over the place. They're pretty short and bite-sized. They're pretty breezy, pretty easy to kind of just play. Of course, I want you focused in to my stimulating conversation, but they're also a good thing to have on in the background too.
Yeah, and we have all those recorded, I think, as well, and in the Punch Down. And then on the Innovent side of things, I know Sarah, Chris, I think sometimes you might get involved in some of our trainings that we do for clients. There are a lot of clients here today, which I was excited to see. And we have academy training sessions. So obviously we're talking a lot about training. We train you on Innovent, but also have cool things just around harvest and that directly tie into some of the things we're talking about. So follow along and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.